thought you would only see them in 3D in those viewers that you've seen in your grandparents' or parents' parlors there. You can see some debris of battle over here. You can see one of Brady's photographic assistants, who usually has his sleeves rolled up and sometimes has that hat there. You can see part of the field of Pickett's charge over there, and Frazanito dissects this image a little bit in his books. And then, of course, you can see a famous rock right up there. When this photo was taken, it would be 25 years until General Warren would actually occupy the one boulder on the battlefield on which you're specifically prohibited from standing, the Warren Rock. Now, there are not only stone walls now everywhere around the battlefield, there are also stone walls on Culp's Hill topped with logs, topped with earth, or fronted with earth and whatnot, such as these on Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill getting a lot more visitation now for two reasons. I could say this as a guide. One, because of the excellent clearing that has been done there. Two, Little Round Top's closed and Culp's Hill is getting its day. Back in the day, Culp's Hill was the place to go. It was close to town. It had a lot of visible damage that you could see, and Culp's Hill was the place for quite a long time for people to go and see. You know, and sometimes the town's buildings just served as backdrops for horrific scenes, such as some of the 80 horses that were supposedly killed outside next to a Massachusetts battery, or as part of a Massachusetts battery. I think famously, many of you know, you stop here, you can line up this specific rock here with the corner of this trestle barn, and everybody seems to know not only about the dead horses in the foreground, but also about the artillery shell hole actually in the wall. And when you look in, you can actually see it's a pretty jagged hole. And just this week on my tour, somebody said, but the hole looks too round to have been caused by artillery. Well, when you zoom in there, you can see it was a much more jagged hole when it was photographed on roughly July 7th, 1863. On the right, we also see sometimes they don't go through things. Here's a shell that actually lodged in the Sherfy tree there. I'm sorry, a cannonball. And of course, this is something they do very well downstairs in the museum. I hope you've gotten to see the cannonball and the recreated tree there. And of course, trees were what really drew people to Culp's Hill and around the battlefield. Here, you could see the terrible debris of battle. Here, you could see a tree evidently knocked down from the constant fire. Here, you could see not only pockmarks in the tree, but I think in some of these I can see some shrapnel or something sticking out of them. It's really hard to determine, you know, where the actual inner tree is versus if it's a piece of something. And there's Shaggy again, by the way, sitting with his cool linen duster. To be a Civil War photographer, man, Brady wore a duster, so you need to wear a duster as well. And, you know, here you have, I mean, just look at this battle damage on Culp's Hill just a week and a half to 2 weeks after the battle, to the point where what other town in America is going to put this in the newspaper? The cutting of bullets from trees is strictly prohibited, okay? Gettysburg immediately emerged as a place that's different from other places in America. There was this big battle here, and like I said, Gettysburg Address. Like I said, first place preserved as a Civil War battlefield park and near population centers. So Gettysburg became different in those first 3 days of July and further on in 1863. And in panoramic photos, panoramic style photos, you can look from Little Round Top in this case and see again much of the field of Pickett's charge, even if not in as much detail as we'd like. Ziegler's Grove right there in the distance, the Union Line, and you can go there today, of course, thanks to Frazanito, and we'll be talking about him as well, and see how that photo relates to what you see today. You can also go back to the original photo and zoom in and see all sorts of goodies, or I'll call them digital goodies, because we can zoom in so easily now. You know how hard this was 30 years ago to zoom in on a photo? I mean, you buy a stronger magnifying glass and hope your print is good enough to see anything? Well, check this out. Just north of the Wheatfield Road that you can see in the foreground, you can see where the Army busted through stone walls, what paths they were taking, and how they were moving around the field and dodging around the rocks. And if anybody doesn't know, this rock is easy to find along Sedgwick Avenue, just north of Little Round Top. You can see the George Weichert farm buildings, and you could still line up all this stuff, and you could trace their path. That is, if you're a big enough Civil War and Gettysburg nerd. You'll never run out of things to do if you are. And I think unconfirmed reports suggest there might be a few of you in the room today. you know, around town, somebody's crops, like somebody planted these crops presumably in the spring, and it was probably a guy named Raffensperger or Menchie on East Cemetery Hill, and all of a sudden your crops are trampled. They're building demi-lune-shaped cannon protectors here, fortifications called lunettes, in and among your crops here. This is East Cemetery Hill, and you can see that farmer's going to have more problems than just a loss of crops at that point. You can see that even the old stone walls that had been here along East Cemetery Hill, the photo I showed at the beginning showed this wall in the foreground. Right now, this is all woods, and the water tower is right here. And the American Battlefield Trust actually owns this land now and a little bit beyond it. But here is a two-plate panorama, which we're actually not entirely sure who took it. Wow, we still have work to do. There's a lot of Civil War and Gettysburg photo mysteries still to solve. These two photos used to be labeled as Culpeper and other things. Fresnito talks about them in his first book here, and you can see all sorts of great things in town. I'm seeing the German Reformed Church and the church on High Street here, Oak Hill and Oak Ridge off in the distance there. You can just look at these photos and delve in, and I think you'll have a satisfying experience if you just do it. Just zoom into these photos, go to the Library of Congress, where I've gotten 90% of these pictures, just download the highest resolution and zoom in and start scrolling around, and I think at a minimum you'll find something that's of interest to you, and maybe more. The town now had a barricade going right through the town. Here's the train station on July 4th or 5th, 1863. The battle didn't just end on the 3rd. The troops are still there. They're sniping at one another, dodging through towns, at doorways and whatnot. And there's apparently this barricade right over there near the train station, right next to the Majestic Theater there, and of course the Lincoln Diner, which we all know was already there. And all of a sudden, it's not bad enough that you have stuff all over the place, but, your fence rails are coming down to serve the inside of the lunettes. This is the only known picture that I know of that actually shows the interior of lunettes, these cannon protectors at Gettysburg. They're not just earth. They're taking these rails, and these look a lot like fence rails. And what do you know? The fence rails along the Baltimore Pike are just conspicuously absent at this point, and it would not be for long until a lot of these rails would be returned. In fact, it is this piece of land you see right in the distance here, between these lunettes and here, that a local guy named David McConaughey said we should set aside and preserve 4 acres east of Cemetery Hill, which to me is the first time somebody separated Cemetery Hill from what we now call East Cemetery Hill. And this was, by the way, in July of 1863, and he'd settled on this land by August, and that is the first land preserved as a park of the Civil War in American history. And the only one I know of any war that was preserved earlier for that purpose is Fort Ticonderoga. So before long, this would be preserved, and he did it to preserve the natural fortifications, namely those lunettes. He said it. Oh, sorry, Chris, did you get it? And we can really delve into various panoramas here. And I'm only getting into the town for now. I would love to have 3 or 4 hours to talk about the town, the dead, the wounded, the prisoners. And this is, of course, what Coco does very well in Strange and Blighted Land, in almost those exact categories. And then its emergence as a battlefield into a historic shrine. But if you just take this famous Brady 2-plate panorama that I still love the way they used in the Gettysburg movie, they kind of colored it and painted it over so that it looked like Buford was standing in front of the town. Let's just start to zoom around this photo a little bit, starting with this section here. By the way, we are looking eastward toward town, a little east-southeast from the Casper Henry Dustman farm next to what we now call Lee's headquarters. You can see again that the fence rails have been removed in substantial sections of the Chambersburg Pike. If we move over a little bit, you can see Pennsylvania College, a place that would be forever changed. Note, it's not called Pennsylvania College anymore, and I can't help but think that maybe the notoriety of the town of Gettysburg, made famous by the battle and the Gettysburg Address, maybe had something to do with that change. Of course, Mathew Brady went down the hill, took a picture of a guy staring at the Lutheran Theological Seminary, and then about 50 feet back from there, crossed the railroad tracks and recorded this photo the same day as this photo here. Okay, now if you go into the foreground, you can see, as Fresnito says, maybe 1 and if not 2 graves in the foreground. We'll be talking about that a little bit more as well. Looking through town here, you can see the Gettysburg train station, not yet especially notable yet, right? Because you have it in 1863 as a place where wounded might be coming in once the train is fixed. Supplies are coming in and out, but Lincoln hadn't gone there yet. soon he's going to go about 4 months later, arrive there, and really forever solidify the fame of that particular structure. If you look toward Cemetery Hill, you're seeing that giant poplar tree I showed you on the opening slide. You can see the tents of a militia camp, some of the first do-gooders to come, so to speak, to town. Sure, they were ordered here, they're militia, but there is a lot that needs to be done. Remember, 2 years earlier, the biggest battle ever fought in American history might have been about 1,500 to 2,000 casualties. Then Bull Run has 4,500. Then Shiloh has 23,000. And then you have the Battle of Chancellorsville with 30,000, and now Gettysburg with 50,000 casualties plus, according to the figures that I like to use. So nobody's ready for these things, even as they're gearing up for war. You can not only see the giant poplar here, but a tree that you constantly see. Again, I pointed out the 4 plateau sort of tree over there. You can see that these are the houses backing the Baltimore Pike at Gettysburg. You can even make out some of the lunettes that I keep pointing out on East Cemetery Hill and the Evergreen Gatehouse. Who'd have thought when you look approximately from Lee's headquarters that you're looking directly down the Baltimore Pike after it makes its curve? Pretty cool. Of course, you have the famous Jacob Sheed's house associated with a famous story with Carrie Sheeds and hiding a sword. Pretty cool stuff. You have the Adams County Courthouse, and then there is, of course, more. Because when you look right down the road, right there, you have the house of none other than John Burns, who was photographed by 3 different photographers. John Burns, of course, is known as the only civilian to come out and actually defend the town. He's wounded 3 times, captured by the Southerners, and he becomes an instant hero. Makes the cover of Harper's Weekly, for which there is no equivalent anymore. That is a big deal. Trending on Twitter is nothing compared to making the cover of Harper's Weekly. And he is photographed up on his porch with his wife, who, by the way, had said, "Don't go out there, you'll get hurt." Of course, he gets shot 3 times, dragged home, drags himself across the field, comes home on a wagon. And then what do you think she said to him when he arrived? "I told you not to go out there." And she is, man, she's looking stern in that one picture. But he's photographed most famously by Mathew Brady underneath these steps, and you see it here. And here he is, he supposedly grabs this old War of 1812 musket. Look at his torn clothing and whatnot, the grizzled hands, and he does look pretty tough. But he lived the last 8 years of his life as a hero. Now, by the time Mathew Brady got here, more so than when Alexander Gardner, the first photographer to arrive, who was the only one to photograph the dead on the battlefield, Gardner was able to secure that. Brady came a little bit later, and not only did he maybe know a little bit more, because people right after the battle don't know these things, but also he was honored in the appointment of being basically the maggot and fly chief, as was everybody in Gettysburg. After a week or two, after the flies have infested all of the corpses all around the battlefield, the place became a place of horror. The surgeons at one of the Gettysburg hospitals talked about an inability to even inhale without getting flies in your mouth. Every fence post was blackened with the flies after the battle. And John Burns, there's no exception here. A friend of mine named John Richter actually located some flies on John Burns. See, we have 2 different pictures of John Burns, so you can see what is a speck on the negative and what is actually a fly. And then I went and made the mistake of finding 1 or 2 more and telling him about it. And you can see, like, look there. I mean, that's a fly. I mean, there's really no doubt about it there. And anyway, John, who made the initial discovery of the flies, didn't like that and went and looked again and found 14 flies on and around John Burns. Now, I preface it with the idea that there's billions of flies here. I don't think I'm exaggerating either. I think 1 corpse can give 400,000 maggots, I once heard, from some sort of not endocrinologist. What's the bug person again? Entomologist, thank you. A cancer on my mind, I guess. So here we got it. And I don't want to blame John Burns, because I think there was flies everywhere at the time. But it's tempting to think that maybe he's not the most cleanly of people. At least for me, who judges people of the past all the time, but never on social media, because that's completely unproductive. Now, we have a photo that hardly anybody ever sees, taken by Gutekunst, one of 7 he took in town. And again, I know this only because Frazanito has explained it very well, looking the exact opposite direction. In fact, here are the Casper Henry Dussman buildings in the distance, and that 2-plate panorama looks directly up the pike. or down the pike, and here we have it looking back up. There's the Lutheran Theological Seminary. There's the famous railroad cut, at least the Oak Ridge Railroad cut there. And let's zoom around this a little bit, but you can see that this place had seen a lot of wear and tear. Again, this is one of the improved roads, a turnpike that came into Gettysburg. There's going to be toll houses associated with keeping these roads as nice as you see them, although they were probably a little nicer before the battle. Zooming in up here, you can actually see, it looks like there's a carriage on the crest up there. You're looking up the pike here over toward the Dustman House. That two-plate panorama was either taken from the second floor here or from the barn. We're not exactly sure. But you can see some of the damage to some of these fences here. And incidentally, you're looking in reverse of the site of the famous 3 Confederate prisoners who I believe are under this tree when they are photographed. And you can see that tree hanging down off the top of the plate right over there, which is endlessly interesting. Here is, out of order, a photo of that same thing. You can see the Philip Henry Charles Croft House, if I got that right. And across the way, a beautiful shot of the Sheeds House, the Dustman Buildings, and not quite able to see the Thompson House, known as Lee's headquarters over there. Beautiful view of the railroad cut and everything. Just an astounding picture that hardly anybody ever sees. And you can get that in Frazanito's early photography at Gettysburg. The town suffered indeed. You have straight up, battle damage right in town. This photo remained unknown to us until just several years ago when Ron Parashow purchased it. This is when I got the photos off of eBay, but you can see this full picture downstairs in the gallery, actually. See the whole thing. And we had no idea that there was damage captured on glass, in this case by an amateur photographer named Corley's. We had no idea that any of this had actually gotten there. And if you really start zooming in, you can see exactly where the damage was repaired based on even through the paint of today. And yes, if you're a big enough loser like I am, you can line up individual bullet holes from the original compared to today's. And most battlefield guides point out this house. We've been doing it for years, and now we actually have a photo of it, the Swan Hotel. Of course, the most famous thing going on in town, besides, even maybe trumping John Burns, is Jenny Wade. Sweet, innocent Virginia Jenny Wade, who you see here on the right, who's baking bread for the soldiers behind 2 sturdy oak doors. And some of those projectiles, just like they went through the Swan Hotel, went in and, of course, killed Jenny Wade on, I believe, July 3rd, 1863. I won't tell it in front of the group because we're talking about death and aftermath, but if anybody wants to hear by far the worst joke of the Civil War, I'll tell it to you offline afterward as concerns Jenny Wade. Now, once in a while, big Civil War nerds get into this idea that it would have been so cool to live here at the time of the battle. In fact, in the Devil's Den book that some of you were able to get today, Tim caught me writing only one division would have the honor to fight at Devil's Den. And Tim's like, what are you talking about? Nobody wants to be there. It's the worst place in the world. It's like hell, or something like that, to be at these places. And so it would be for people like the Sherfys and the Cadoris and the Wentzes and all of those local names that so many of us know so well. Each hash mark on here is a dead soldier that was supposedly buried there. Union soldiers with sort of plus signs, Confederate soldiers with single hash marks, dead horses with the sort of sideways commas. And, this is to say nothing about everything else that's going on with their farm, about their crops being destroyed, about maybe their wells being poisoned for one reason or another. This, by the way, is the Emmitsburg Road here, and you can see, I just showed you a slice of this Elliott burial map, which members of this historical society, Tim Smith notably, were able to locate one of these maps for Antietam, which just blew all of our minds. And this was sad. I mean, it's one thing to see it, a hash mark, on a map. It's another one to read the accounts and see terrible photos like this, of which this is an especially close detail. We have accounts of what the stench was like around Gettysburg. We have accounts of people, soldiers themselves, who were used to seeing these things, actually vomiting as a result of seeing and smelling the battlefield afterward, of actually being sickened yourself and suffering longer-term health concerns just from this. In this case, we have accounts, too, of people talking about the dead and how they had twisted leaves in their agonies and how their mouths had filled with soil. They had literally bitten the dust. And you see somebody here laid out for burial in just that situation. And what you're seeing here is the exact opposite of what they called in the 19th century a good death. This is not how people wanted to be, see their end. They wanted to die at home, and if they couldn't die at home, they wanted a decent burial, not, bleaching to the sun, face up or face down, pressed to the earth. Sometimes their clothes are ragged, their shoes are gone. Terrible situation when you see this. And this is what really, when people think about the aftermath, they think about the dead. And that happens to have been the fascination of the first photographic team to arrive here, Alexander Gardner and his crew. But, a lot of people aren't photographed, in death, and I think that's probably a good thing. And by the way, a lot of people on other battlefields aren't photographed. There are some battles for which we have no 19th century photography. And in some cases, we have a lot more. In this case, we have a pre-battle photo of Isaac Nichol. He's one of the many captains in the 124th New York. He is supposedly killed at the furthest point of the advance of that famous charge of that unit, and Nichol lay there. And we really didn't know a lot about that, except that a Confederate soldier in Benning's brigade found a Bible on one of the soldiers down near the Confederate position, took it, and didn't open it till the retreat when he was somewhere near Chambersburg. And he opened it and saw the note from Nichol saying, if this is found upon my body, please return this Bible to my father in Orange County, New York. And the soldier dropped it off in Chambersburg, and a local person was able to get it back to his dad. His dad knew he died, came back, got his body, and was able to bury him in Orange County. One of the other famous and hard to tell stories about this happened right in some of your field of vision right now. This is Bayard Wilkeson. He's a young battery commander on the left, of course. I think you know what happens. He's going to suffer a terrible wound, which he may or may not have helped to amputate one of his limbs with a penknife afterward. People disagree about that, but Tim says that the story probably doesn't have validity. And in my experience, Tim Smith here of the Adams County Historical Society, when he says something and another Civil War person disagrees with him, and we're able to find out who's right, it's always Tim. So I've learned not to bet against him on stuff like this that concern the battle or the town. Doesn't mean he's always right, especially about his taste in certain things. That's a whole separate story. Now, what many people know about Bayard Wilkeson is that his father, who is a reporter for a New York newspaper, shows up and is confronted with this terrible moment where his son didn't make it through the battle, and said something to the effect of, how can one, write the story of a great battle when you are absorbingly and transcendentally sort of affixed upon the central thing in front of you, the body of an eldest son, sent to a place where a battery should never have been sent, and then left to die in a hospital where no surgeon dared to go. And it has to be one of the most moving accounts of it. And we happen to have this account because he's a reporter, okay? But how many other instances in the Civil War with hundreds of thousands of dead that we can't even tell their stories? We can only try to extrapolate from the ones we know and maybe understand the horror of this conflict a little bit more. And something about the photography of the battlefield, such as this photo known as the Harvest of Death, and this photo, the same corpses from a different direction, really just shocked the nation. And these two photos, it's really 5 of them of the same group of bodies, are thought to be the first photos recorded after the battle. That's important because, number one, there were only a handful of photos taken in Gettysburg before 1863, and they're of buildings: Gettysburg College, the Globe Tavern, the town square. We have very few, the Circle, the Diamond, just to cover all my bases there. So whatever it is, wherever it is, and this is one of our mysteries, it's the earliest thing that it depicts. It's the earliest depiction of it. So it's of great interest if we can locate these one day, and this is the ultimate Civil War photographic mystery, if you ask me. So this was last week, Fresnito and I. So I think it's about 2004 at Devil's Den, but I'm here right now because of him, because I picked up his book as a high school student, and I remind my kids with frequency when I'm traveling too much doing Civil War stuff, because they would not exist if I hadn't picked up his books and I hadn't gotten obsessed with the Civil War. My wife's a Pennsylvanian. It just would have never happened. So what Bill did, as many of you know, is take Civil War photos, look at them critically, see what you can learn from them, separate them by photographer, try to find out where they were taken, and therefore 2 things. 1, turn a photo that just might shock or appreciate into something that is a primary document, more rich in information than almost any other source. It's really hard to disagree with an account of a stone wall when you see it right there. Okay? And 2, to bring the viewer back to the moment of exposure. That's his journey in time. Okay? Gettysburg, A Journey in Time, is to put you there at the same place and the same time with as much information as possible. And of course, he's going to have great success with this in the 1960s. 3 months before I was born, he located the slaughter pen, which was long thought to be at the foot of Little Round Top, but that is in fact Big Round Top in the background. And because he did that, you can line up all sorts of photos. You can find that rock, the table-like boulder, and now rocks have names because now we know where they are and how they're significant. And you can, of course, see the dead around here in various positions. And remember, 4 wounded for every soldier killed. This photo is one of about 40 or 42 taken at Gettysburg that show the human carnage at Gettysburg. There's only about 102 in the entire Civil War, so Gettysburg's coverage represents a full 40% of all the dead ever photographed on battlefields of the Civil War. When he found that location, other things fell into place, such as these 2 soldiers right in the Valley of Death next to the parking area. Many of you have seen this before. It looks like this. But I think the purpose here is that now that we know when and where it was taken, right after the battle, I can narrow these guys down to about 45 guys, okay? I know that they're probably in the right elements of the 44th Alabama or somewhere in the 2nd Georgia, maybe the 48th Alabama, but I doubt it. And a lot of those soldiers died in hospitals. Some of them, we know their burial location, so maybe that's the best we can do for them. Now, you can also sort of, zoom in, and if you look at this soldier right here, who, by the way, charged into battle full of life just a couple of days before this photo was taken, and now he is this. He is a grotesque-looking, nameless corpse, and when you really zoom in on it, you see the horror of this. He doesn't look like a soldier anymore. He looks, grotesque, you could say, and you can see he has been shot in the right temple, and his brain matter is oozing out into a little puddle next to him, right? And I don't do this to glorify it. I show you this because that guy was not mortally wounded. That guy died right there. And because he died right there, we can start to speculate other things. Is he behind that rock hiding? Did a bullet come in from Little Round Top and hit him over there? We can just learn more once we know when and where a photo was taken. And then 2 months later, 35 days before I was born, Fresnito located where these photos were taken. He knew that there was a V-shaped line of bodies who had been laid out but not yet buried. He noticed a distinctive rock and a fence in the background. He noticed that V showed other things. He showed the same bodies in other directions, and he could see more bodies going on there. And he noticed where the photographic wagon was and saw that wagon in different photos, and noticed that a guy with a bent knee was sticking up. You could see him in various photos taken in various directions there. And beyond, by the way, this photographic wagon is the first photographic depiction of the peach orchard at Gettysburg. By going out there, you stand there, you line it up, and you know you're looking right at the peach orchard. Okay? So pretty cool stuff. You can't see much, but I'll take it. I'm seeing some peach trees over there. And finally, Fresnito, lined it up. There's the guy with the bent knee again. And he figured, if I can find these 4 rocks, everything else will fall into place. He made himself a map to help him understand better. Here's the V. Here's the guy with the bent knee. Here's those guys I just showed you there. And maybe it'll all work out. And then finally, on March 10th, 1967, I got the number of days wrong for my birthday, but I don't think I want you knowing my birthday anyway. It's weird. You could see he sketched it out, and there it was. In the woods at the time, on the Rose Farm. This was not, as they were captioned, dead of the Iron Brigade, dead of the 24th Michigan, dead from Pickett's charge. Rather, they were on a nondescript portion of wooded battlefield that nobody expected them to be, and it changes our understanding of it. So now we can go back there, and we can look at these 4 boulders there, and we can line up those 4 boulders in the exact same way when you go. Now, we can then take 3D photos of, again, here's the guy with the bent knee, and put them there and have these windows fit in with your natural 3D vision, which I sort of call a 4-dimensional experience. More discoveries followed later after his book comes out. You ever write a book? Right, Jim? You write a book, you find out some of the best stuff right after it comes out. After Journey in Time came out, a kid located where this soldier was. This soldier, bloated and drenched by recent showers and emitting odors of the most offensive nature, this poor soul had been lying motionless in death when his distorted form attracted the camera of Alexander Gardner. He chose probably to have his face not visible. And there's just no doubt that these are the same rocks that you see in these photos here, and now we know where he is, and we can perform the same type of thing. Again, 44th Alabama, maybe 48th Alabama, 2nd Georgia, and start to narrow things down. It wasn't long till he discovered another set of photos. There's 3 photos taken here. I'll show you 2 of them that you hardly ever see. This is along what we now call the trolley path of the Boy Scout Trail, just to the south, kind of south slaughter pen there. You usually don't see these photos. Again, these are some of the roughly 40 photos of the dead at Gettysburg. Another photo mystery followed, and Frazanito cracked it. By the way, with the all over now, the lone soldier whose face you couldn't see in this one, I found these. Frazanito had already located them, but hadn't told anybody yet. It's still satisfying. Even to take Bill's books out and do it for yourself and line them up. There's something about it that works. Again, that 4-dimensional experience, standing there where the camera was and using the photo to imagine or better understand what had happened. Here you see a Confederate soldier with a prop gun here. You're seeing the inside of the triangular field, where some people love saying photos don't come out in the triangular field because of some ghostly thing. Well, Alexander Gardner's photo came out really early on, and apparently some sort of a shelter that a soldier, had built. Those rocks are still there today. It's pretty nasty with thorns and whatnot, but there they are. And of course, on other parts of the field, you see how the town is being affected. Look, they took the stone wall from what we now call the edge of the cemetery, and they extended it into the road. They didn't want the Southerners bum rushing into town with cavalry or anything like that, so they extended it out. Looks like they took it a little bit here and just left a little pass-through over there, right? By the way, you're seeing the town of Gettysburg. You're seeing Oak Hill. What a beautiful photo by Alexander Gardner. The mammoth tree I showed you at the beginning. The Adams County Courthouse, and again, that militia encampment I pointed out earlier, and again, still that same stone wall that I keep pointing out along where, you have monuments and whatnot today. When you really zoom in, this is a pretty bad photo, but it looks like I zoomed in on the wall there. In another one, you can see a strange structure here that happens to comport pretty well with an identified grave of a guy from Ohio who died there. I'm not saying this is what it is, but I don't know what it is, and it's in about the right spot if the Elliott map is correct. Again, we can line it up. We know where these lunettes are, and we know where these lunettes approximately are. So it's about in the right spot. It's pretty close to the road, which you see right here. So you can start to use these various sources together to understand the subject about which many of us are obsessed. You go back to this photo I was showing you earlier, and you look in the foreground, I think you can see a grave right there. It looks like fresh dirt. It looks like about the right size. And again, I hadn't seen this in a book or anything. It was just me playing around with photos. There's no real magic here other than taking the time and using your imagination. Now, when it comes to the aftermath of the dead, nothing has gained more attention, I think, than the dead sharpshooter. That's what it's called, the home of a rebel sharpshooter. I think you know the story. This guy is killed here. There's 4 photos taken of him, and then they went to the top of the hill and found the perfect spot, but no corpse. So they dragged him up to right here. You can see it in the background, actually. These are the rocks that form the home of the rebel sharpshooter. We've done this with somebody who was here today, Ian Isherwood, actually, who's, probably weighs about the same amount I did, and we dragged him on a blanket. Let me tell you, it's not easy to drag even a light person that far, so that was very instructive, especially on a hot day. And by the way, when you look up from this guy too, you see he's different, right? He doesn't look bloated. He looks like he could be your kid or something like that. Maybe he was mortally wounded. Maybe, as people who know these things told me, he's of a different composition, and his body didn't succumb to putrefaction in the same way of the others. I don't know. But I will say that when you stand here now and you look above this rock here, you see the massive tree at Devil's Den. I think that's evidence, not only its size, but that's evidence enough for me to tell me that that's a witness tree. Some people disagree about that being a witness tree. Tim Smith among them. It seems like I'm not heeding my own advice about listening to Tim when somebody else disagrees. In any case, there are 4 different photos of him in this location, and then 2 up top. This is the most photographed corpse of the Civil War. This is an aftermath talk, so I hope none of you are shocked that I'm talking so plainly about this stuff, but you can see these rocks still. You can see the Park Service has done a nice job keeping trees where they belong. And of course, this is the photo that became so famous. Little round top in the background. You can't really see it here. This same soldier who you can see doesn't look like all of the others. The prop gun, the same one again, like he's laying out his death, and there's an extensive caption written about it, and it became one of the most famous photos of the Civil War for that reason. Now, I'm going to talk about something that I just made up and I'm coining right now, and that is aftermath myths or aftermyths, okay? Because Alexander Gardner put this in his sketchbook about how this was a rebel sharpshooter and that there was not a mark on his body. So that birthed several other things. One, that he must have been killed by concussion. A shell came in and hit the rock on the other side of him. And because he was killed by concussion, then 10 people were killed by concussion until everybody who died at Devil's Den was killed by concussion. The post-war lore is just nuts about this stuff. People made up all sorts of stories about him. I mean, the soldier was killed at Gettysburg. I'm not trying to take away anything from him, but he doesn't have a sharpshooter's gun. He's not killed at a place where you could really snipe very well. There's all this stuff going on. People have been trying to identify him ever since. There's a story that it's this guy named Hoge from the 1st Texas, but identifying rocks is a lot easier than people. His hairline's a little bit different. Sure, he looks similar, to this guy, but there's another woman who said that it was her son. This going back 100 years, and but that guy fought in the 2nd Virginia. I think it was on the totally opposite side of the field. More recently, in a newspaper, somebody thinks he's a Georgian, a guy I think named Ash, with which I disagree. His big thing is like, look at that hairline. That must be the same guy. And there was a lot of ifs there, so I just don't agree with that one either. I don't know that I'm right. In the case of people, it's very difficult, although we do have this thing called Civil War Photo Sleuth now, and they're growing this database where you can upload pictures of the Civil War that are unidentified, and they'll start to match them using facial recognition. Fascinating, and I encourage you to upload your photos there. It's all free to use. Of course, we have some unidentified photos of the dead at Gettysburg, and this is one of the most horrific. You can see somebody has been disemboweled, probably by some wild boars in the area. If you look off to the left, you can actually see another gravestone, somebody who was lucky enough to get a burial. I wish we could read something on it, but we cannot. But that's somebody who was buried by friends, to be sure. And of course, you have the famous photos of not just people moving on, toward horses. I showed you one picture already of them. In a different version of this, you can see a horse right in the road that's there for, at least 5 days after the battle. And you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 dead horses here alone at General Meade's headquarters. When you zoom in, you can see it does not improve at all upon moving in. There's a famous photo, well, famous to some of us, called Unfit for Service, showing this and something more interesting that I really wish would help us sometime. These guys are on some sort of a lane. There's a big row of something going on here. We don't know the location of this. I hope that we have enough where somebody will identify those trees in another 1863 photo and that we'll figure this one out. But like I showed you earlier, it's the ones at the Trossel House that have garnered the most interest over the years. And here we have some of the dead horses of the 9th Massachusetts Battery. The 2 rocks still sit there today, where a monument to the 150th New York still stands to this day. The addition on the house has now been completed over here. And you can actually see some of what we call the Sickles tree right here. Some people say, how do you know that's a witness tree? How do you know that's a witness tree? Well, without doing core samples, which the park does not do as a matter of course, it's just people saying, well, that's a witness tree. I at least like using photographic evidence. In this case, this tree is visible in this photo, and then 5 years later, and then 10 years later, and 10 years later. So that is definitely, the Sickles tree is a witness tree. When you zoom in on that photo, I really like this because supposedly, the 9th Massachusetts Battery kind of got stuck here. There was a fence here, there was a stone wall with a fence on top of it there, hog tight and cow high. And we know that some of those guns tried to bust through the wall. Well, when you zoom in, you can see a section that's sort of gone. Is this where one of the guns got away and where in the attempt maybe this limber carriage sort of got in the way here? We can zoom in and connect the photos with battle accounts, which I think is very valuable. We, of course, not only have dead horses, but we have soldiers and people playing as dead on the battlefield. On one other battlefield, we actually have a living person posing next to a corpse at Petersburg. But here are these guys clearly in the winter. There's no leaves on the trees. This is not a July photo, and nobody dies in these positions. I mean, look at this. Beside which, we have other photos of these same guys in different positions on different rocks. So unless the photographer's dragging these same guys around at different rocks for no apparent reason in November, it's probably posed. Not to mention that one of these guys left a journal. His name is Jacob Schenkel, and said that they went out with the photographers and posed as dead. So I think we've wrapped this one up. I'm not quite sure. There's some skeptics in the room. Of course, we not only have photos of the dead on the field, but we have photos of graves. In this case, a burial trench with Confederate soldiers in it below the top of Culp's Hill, sort of closer to the saddle there. And we can find out exactly where this is. There's some rocks in the background that are hard to see in this version, but that you can still line up today. This is before the dead had been removed. This is 1867. So many of these the Confederate soldiers are still in these. You go out there now, and there's all sorts of undulations in the ground, some of which are dumps, and some of which used to be Confederate graves before they were largely removed south as unidentified piles of bones by a Southern ladies group who didn't pay the local doctor to do it, although they said they would. And then, of course, we have aftermath photos. Give me a sec. That was all one sentence so far. That's kind of true. And then we have photos that show the Soldiers' National Cemetery dedication. The second most photographed sort of event after the immediate aftermath is this, where several different photographers came, recorded all sorts of photos here. You can see why the Gettysburg Address was actually delivered, along with all the consecration ceremonies, off of the modern cemetery. Look, you can see these temporary headboards, some of which I showed you in the opening photo. You can't have crowds gathered upon this hallowed ground right there. You see they're literally burying soldiers, and they stopped for a couple of days just to let these exercises go by. And as you know, we have several photos of this event. You can see the Evergreen Gatehouse from the back, which is pretty cool. You see soldiers keeping the order here. You can see the raised platform up here with the main speaker, Edward Everett, affecting what's going on there. You see that tent there? That's for his personal use, because from what I understand, he has a urinary problem that allowed him to hold it for 2 hours, okay? And his speech was 2 hours. Okay, he needed a bathroom for right before and right after, and the older I get, the more I think that way myself. I love that people are literally gathering for the Gettysburg Address and hanging out on the lunettes from the battle 4 months earlier. Look, you can just see them silhouetted along there. You can see Culp's Hill in the distance in some of the photos. And when you start zooming in, you can almost sort of get an idea of what it might have felt like when you start looking up on the platform. Who's up there? In what order are they? Can we pick anybody out? And of course, the ultimate thing is to try to pick out Abraham Lincoln. Well, I'm here to announce today, people have been talking about it a lot, you know, and you can see maybe a few top hats in the crowd, and people have sort of said, you know, I know which top hat is Lincoln because it must be Lincoln. Well, I am here to tell you that when you really zoom in and start looking, that I have found Abraham Lincoln. He is right there. I found him 60 times in this photo there, so I'm happy. Thank you, my cut and pasting worked. Excellent. And of course, in town, you know, in a world, could you imagine there's no FEMA, there's no Red Cross, there's no CDC, any of these things are around yet, and David Wills's house, a block from here, and the Fahnestock house became the FEMA, the CDC, and the, you know, and the Red Cross all at once. And here you have the first do-gooders who aren't militia soldiers really arriving into town. We can look at them and see who these people are. Maybe they're delivering supplies. Maybe they're there to profit somehow from it. But from what we can tell, people flocked to Gettysburg. Look, you can see the motion here. I wish we could read all these signs a little bit better, especially that one. I'm curious about it for some reason, and to see it. And that's when you start getting into the hospitals, because all of a sudden there's, what, 30,000 wounded, 22, at least 20, some say as much as 28,000 wounded left behind. And before, there was a general hospital like this at Camp Letterman, who Letterman, by the way, stayed and left with the armies and left some other poor sap saying like, okay, by the way, I'm leaving. There's 60 hospitals. Make a general one and name it after me. I'm out of here. And that's Camp Letterman. You can see the German Reformed Church and other things in town there in the distance. But this is after they got things really well set up a week or two after the battle. Before that, you had these division-level hospitals. Here, you have one for the 2nd Corps, a large one for the 11th Corps. These hospitals could have as many as 1,500 soldiers in them at a time. And here you have, again, we can zoom in on them, some of the nurses, some of the people who have come to help. Here you have a soldier who has, you know, just suffered an amputation, and some of, no doubt, his nurses right there at the U.S. Christian Commission. That's an official government entity as opposed to, the U.S. Christian Commission is all volunteer. They're trying to convert people to Christianity and raise money for their efforts, but they're doing that. And at the same time, the Sanitary Commission is an entity where people are actually paid to come, and luckily they both did. They were both necessary, even if they competed sometimes. they would, these hospitals look pretty nice, when you look at them now, but when you read the soldier accounts, there's a New Yorker who actually had seen plenty of battles, not the least of which is Chancellorsville, and went to see some of his comrades in the hospital, and he went there and was already completely disturbed by what he saw. He was getting ready to leave because he couldn't handle it when one of his soldiers jumped up and tried to actually yell something to him, and because he had been wounded in the chest, he got sprayed with the blood of this man, and he got sprayed all over the face and whatnot, and he left. And he wrote that he was embarrassed that he left, but so terrible was this place. And this was just one of the 60 hospitals that he was not able to deal with it, and he felt it, reflected upon him or his honor. Zooming in again, I think these people, they definitely preserved life, and this is for Union soldiers and Confederate soldiers. A lot of Southerners couldn't possibly be moved, despite the 17-mile wagon train of wounded you always hear about. A lot of them were still left behind, wounded and captured, or simply unable to be moved. And the Union soldiers who were still in Camp Letterman are largely those who could not be shipped off to Philadelphia or, New York without endangering them. Every barn in the meantime, if you had a barn and some water and a road or a lane, that's your hospital. You're all set. And in the meantime, you have the soldier experience itself. This isn't at Gettysburg, but what a cool photo it is. And you look at this guy's got a cigar, that guy's got a cigar. When you start zooming in on these photos, you see endless things. And what you find is that these soldiers, whether they survived or not, they were writing things like that they were so overcome with exhaustion and heat of battle that they were shoving tobacco in their eyes just to stay awake while they were on post or on picket duty, because it's death to your comrades and maybe to you if you fall asleep on post. And by the way, could you imagine taking that cigar and shoving it in your eyes as a means to stay awake? So the aftermath includes what the soldiers are constantly going through. And by the way, this dude has seen something. I'll tell you what, if all the people in this photo are others, I don't want to tangle with him. I'm going to lose. I like getting into that. And what do we have? 1,000 stories of the wounded at Gettysburg, one of the most famous of which is a guy named John Chase, who's with a Maine battery, and he suffers, as you see, terrible wounds all over him, and is left for dead in a dead wagon, wakes up, gets a pension, and then, serves as a rally around the cause. Maybe you could say waving the bloody shirt, but literally as business cards showing his torso and all the wounds on it, but saying, what this cost me. You have to remember this. And that's part of the aftermath, to be sure. It's also the idea of memorialization. Here's an early rock carving. This is actually a painting in a rock near Devil's Den. And the idea that these guys carved this, and then people would come back later and go to where John Wheeler, the highest ranking guy from Indiana to be killed at Gettysburg, and then find that rock. And then people put American flags actually there. That people would come and profit from the battlefield on Culp's Hill here. Hoofland's German bitters, which are on all the historic sites, Gaines's Mill, John Brown's Fort, and other liver pills as well, selling snake oil to people trying to tour the battlefield. This photo was entitled Desecration of the Gettysburg Battlefield in 1867. And in addition to the wounded and what's going on the battlefield, memorializing the soldier experience, of course you have prisoners. We do not have a cornucopia of photos of prisoners here at Gettysburg. In fact, this one's going to have to do, but it happens to be in the top 3 most famous photos of the Civil War, helped by Ken Burns and Shelby Foote, to be sure. And then you have after myths with them too. Everybody wants that to be their ancestor, and everything like that. Unfortunately, the post office didn't really check when somebody says, I know them all, and then they labeled and put out stamps of this, okay? By the way, one's dead by now, if these are the right names. One is sitting in a hospital in Winchester, and these dudes are supposed to be father and son, if their account is correct. People have been trying to identify these guys. I do think there are some viable ways to figure out what Confederates are still here when Mathew Brady is here in mid-July of 1863. Who's still here? Who's being photographed? Why? What is their function if the prisoners have all largely been moved away? Were they wounded? Are they performing a task on behalf of the Union Army for the Confederates that are left? We just don't know. And of course, nobody could have seen back then that people would come to Gettysburg in the numbers that they do. In fact, Lincoln even said they might know what they did here. They'll never remember what we say here. That's slightly paraphrased. Don't judge me. I do know the whole Gettysburg Address. But that they would come in these numbers and memorize the Gettysburg Address. This is Gettysburg 150, so it's probably not fair, because that was probably the busiest day it's seen since the battle. But wow, what a great thing when we were able to just walk up Little Round Top. Man, this year is crawling by until we can get back up there. It's pretty tough for a lot of us, I know. And that they would go and take other photos around the battlefield and line them up here right after the Devil's Den improvements were largely completed. And that we would make up stories about the snakes. The devil devil's den, eating little kids for breakfast all the time, a capacious mouth swallowing dogs and whatnot, and that some uncaring person would take his devil's den binder while he's trying to show photos, put it next to that snake, and take photos for the amusement of others. And then the two people would go out and find snake skins around there. Of course, this is a little bit smaller than the ones that you hear about in Gettysburg legends, that the snake is named the devil, and Devil's Den is named because of that snake, because they could never kill and capture him. He was probably about that big. Of course, people come to the battlefield and they get hurt. I can't believe somebody fell from the Pennsylvania Monument. Of course, it's an 8th grade boy. I mean, what else would it be? Of course, the one who fell last in the 70s was a girl, I understand, probably also in 8th grade. Neither was killed, from what I understand. I mean, this kid only got one broken bone, leaving his parents to just, God, that kid, you're not in 8th grade, are you? You're good. Okay, good. But people still get hurt. Somebody had to be extracted from the rocks while doing something they shouldn't have been doing last year. Here you have a photo that you never see taken west from Little Round Top in July of 1863. And if I could zoom in this version, which I can't, I could show you cattle grazing in the Valley of Death. Some of the very cattle probably that had so scared the artillery chief of the Union Army, Henry Hunt, who while they were stampeding through the valley, he couldn't get back to his horse. It was his most trying experience at Gettysburg. Despite the bombardment that preceded Pickett's charge, and the battle itself was trying to get back to his horse here, and he said he was very much demoralized by the experience, as was I, when they used to have cattle in the Valley of Death, and when they start chewing on your fiero, like literally. Now, having a fiero, I probably deserved it. But, our Civil War experiences are very personal, right? As was mine, and on my first trip here, in July of 1988, the 125th, it was my first trip to Devil's Den, and I'm a big journal keeper. And back then it wasn't audio, it was all written. And Devil's Den was completely wooded. And I went at 2:15, said somewhere in Devil's Den, and then I looked up and saw the dead sharpshooter's position, which I know you can't see it. Whoa, I just saw the dead sharpshooter position. I'm trembling, I can't breathe right, my heart is pounding quickly, and my mouth is dry. This is amazing. So this is me like in real time the first time I was at Devil's Den. And I don't know about y'all, but to me, it was clear what I was going to do. I was going to go to that spot, even though I already knew he didn't die, that he wasn't killed there, and I was going to lay down there and take a self-timed photo. It came out pretty well, as a matter of fact, right? And, this isn't for everybody, right? This is kind of a little bit maybe morbid, to some, but to me, this is how I get close to history, and there are no rules specifically. Sure, you can't do certain things on a battlefield, but how you interact, if you're happy or sad, the veterans had fun on battlefields. Later, they used the battlefield as a bathroom during and after the battle. So I think that everybody engages with these experiences. I've seen happy people. I've seen people lash out at me. I've seen one pass out, maybe two, actually, probably from the heat or from the intense delivery of a presentation that they couldn't take. But then, I went there about 4 months later and laid down again, and then went there a year later and laid down again, and went there the following winter and laid down again, and then again. And then you get older, you move to Gettysburg, you have your parents take a picture, you become a licensed battlefield guide, and then people ask you to lay down in the spot, okay? And then you write a book about Devil's Den, you take more people there, and then you really start laying down in the spot. And then again, and I am not sharing a quarter of them. I have a lot of these things. And then, of course, you grow some questionable facial hair, continue to lay down there in your favorite t-shirt, and then when you have kids, you take your 6-week-old there, and then it continues to happen even when you're really sunburned. So you can actually see me getting older in this spot. No different with Alfred Watt, of course. My first trip here, man, I wanted to go right to that spot, and so I did on that same trip, wearing the same stuff, Alfred Watt, and blah, 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 blah. And then it wasn't enough. Before Photoshop, I wanted to be next to Alfred Watt. So, and you know how long this took back then to burn and dodge out photographs to do this? So once I realized you could do this, oh yeah, I'm gonna... Somebody actually made a video of me talking as Alfred Watt. Then I wanted to be with the 3 Confederate prisoners. And then I wanted to lay next to the dead sharpshooter. This is a little bit much. And then that wasn't enough, so I wanted me and him laying next to each other in the Devil's Den. And this is before Photoshop. Just this week, I was giving a small tour out at the Rose Farm. And I didn't ask anybody to lay down. She, an 8th grade girl, came up and said, "Can I be the guy with the bent knee? Can I be the guy with the bent knee?" And there it is. And she's like, "Where's his head? Which leg is up?" And, for her, that was her experience. And then she got, a bunch of photos taken of her. You see some of her classmates over there trying to line up other photos. I handed them out and said, see if you can find them. Well, somehow that story resonated again. And by the way, that's the same rock. That's the same rock right there. There's the peach orchard. We didn't quite get this photo right, so you can't quite see it. And that goes for people who find a bullet on a battlefield, especially if it's not in a national park where you might be allowed to actually pick that thing up and not just alert the park. And in fact, the park just recently, while working on Little Round Top, found a dire shell before I even knew what type of shell it was. All of us were speculating. Is this shot from the Confederate line? Is it a short Union shot? Blah, blah, blah. Well, there was only one battery shooting this type of shell that was on that part of the field, and it's Riley's battery, and it landed right next to Warren Avenue, just sitting there since the Battle of Gettysburg. The soldiers would come back and memorialize their comrades, in this case Henry Fuller, one of the least visited monuments on the battlefield. It's hard to find. And Wayne Motts, now head of the Gettysburg Foundation, when he was with the National Civil War Museum, brought his blood-stained tactical manual back out to the spot where it actually happened for the first time since the battle. And this can inform our battlefield experience. That the aftermath can be at once horrific and meaningful, and sometimes fun, as we've seen a little bit today. And of course, as the battlefield has grown, you see that the battlefield was 4 acres during the inaugural year, and then it grew to 5,000. Now it's 6,500. Maybe now it's closer to 7,000, depending on what you count. Does Fairfield count? What counts as the battlefield of Gettysburg? And I work for the American Battlefield Trust. The biggest thing we've ever done here probably is to purchase and restore General Lee's headquarters. I know a lot of you like that hotel. I liked it too, but man, does it look a lot better now. And I'm happy for it that if the soldiers came here today, they could see what Mathew Brady and Mary Thompson, something closer to what they would have seen during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, I think you all know that I like talking about this 2-bit slipshod bargain basement yard sale doghouse that you can see right there. This thing is just, I can't say enough bad things about how shoddy this thing was, and I'll get to that in a second. I doubt people of the past could have figured out that we would then climb onto the roof of a restaurant that was built at the same spot as Dustman's Farm and remake this photo. You can see Gettysburg College there, but it wasn't quite high enough, so you're going to have to wait a little bit. Oh yes, now drones are more easy to use. You can't use them in the park, but we can use them over trust property without any permission, able to get the same. Look at these hills right there, how they're just the same, and you see that while some things do change, a lot of it remains the same. So coming back to my favorite doghouse here, I have been, ever since we knew we were going to redo this, and unfortunately, incredibly, the land that we own at the Trust, we're a land trust, by the way, we educate the public about our early conflicts and save land associated with it. We were paying a local firm named Austin a whole lot of money to take the gables off the windows and everything like that. I said, well, I want a free doghouse. I want you to build a doghouse, but here's 8 pictures of the doghouse. I want you to make it look like crap. I want you to make it look just terrible. Shoddy boards, and I used all those adjectives, 2-bit, bargain basement, and everything. And what did they do? They went and made a beautiful doghouse, okay? A little too nice. Now I went and took power tools and did a lot of this, and then for 7 straight years, I encouraged people to kick the doghouse, to beat this thing up. And I would give demonstrations, say like this, and I would give really hard kicks. And finally, after 7 years, just last week, somebody finally kicked the crap out of that thing, and the little dog inside can testify to it. So we'll fix it up again, but with crooked boards and everything like that. And with that, I thank you so much for all your attention. Thank you.
I know Garry answered a couple questions before, but if you have a few minutes, maybe we'll take a few more from the audience. I'll bring the mic around if anyone has any questions they'd like to ask Garry.
Or you can just yell.
Or you can yell. Sure.
When's the fence coming down by the sharpshooter? Oh, well, once he's talking about Devil's Den, the work is done, but there's one fenced-in area there. The park has reported to us that the seed didn't take, and they need for it to take. And when I went there the other day, it didn't look like it was taken yet. Maybe by this spring it'll take enough where they feel comfortable. If I was a betting man, though, I'd say they're going to wait for a whole season for it to take properly, and then they'll take it down. That's a guess, but from what the... Absolutely not on my authority. No way. My word. But you can take your smartphone right up to the edge of that fence and get that sharpshooter picture pretty well, except the sign's in the way. So what are you going to do? Good question. Anything else?
Any other questions? Well, thanks again. Garry Adelman, everyone.
Thank you. I'm around. no, a third to half of this are things I cobbled together from other shows.
Awesome.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks, man. I'm glad you liked it.
Yes, absolutely.
That was not videoed, right?
It was.
It was great. No, I'm glad.
The only thing is it had a glitch.